approached you with mischief laced in strategy, a glimmer in the eye not of curiosity, but conquest. You felt it. The way they studied you like a board game, something with rules they believed only they understood. You were never a person to them. You were a calculation, a potential high, a test of their ability to outmaneuver, outwit, and outperform your spirit. They baited you with half-truths, poked at your boundaries like soft spots, laughed when your voice cracked under the weight of trying to be understood. To them, it was always entertainment, something to flip, twist, and manipulate at will. But what they never realized was that you weren't playing, you were watching. And when you finally moved, it wasn't retaliation, it was revelation. They thought it was a game. You made it a statement. They banked on your patience, relied on your forgiveness, tested how much damage they could cause before you'd say enough. They threw words like knives, but made sure to smile after each one so no one else would see the blood. It was a slow erosion, engineered with precision. They needed you emotionally tangled so they could stay strategically untouchable. But you took every wound and turned it into a blueprint. You mapped out the manipulation by heart. The tone shifts, the withdrawal patterns, the deflections disguised as vulnerability. You understood their tactics better than they did, and the moment you chose to stop explaining and start evolving, the game board caught fire. Because you weren't a player anymore, you were the lesson. They never expected your silence to speak. They weren't ready for your absence to echo louder than your presence ever did. See, players need opponents. They need friction. They need reaction to feel alive. But when you gave them nothing, no closure, no breakdown, no final message, they panicked. They thought you'd chase, thought you'd beg, thought you'd fold. But you walked with clarity, without a sound. And that walk, that wasn't escape. That was liberation. It wasn't passive. It was precise. It told a story they couldn't reframe. It made them irrelevant in the one place they thought they had dominion: your mind. Psychologically, the manipulator always gambles on your emotional investment. They assume that if they can tangle your feelings, they can control your behavior. But they never account for the moment you decide to stop arguing with a mask. When you see that there's no real person behind their charm, just a shifting identity crafted to survive, the spell breaks. And that moment, that rupture, is irreversible. It's the point where empathy becomes discernment, where love turns into memory, where loyalty transforms into self-respect. You didn't leave the game, you transcended it. And in doing so, you wrote the one rule they couldn't overwrite. You don't need to win to walk away victorious. You never set out to be a statement. You were simply trying to connect, to care. But that purity, that authenticity was something they didn't know how to hold, so they played with it. Treated your openness like clay to be reshaped into something smaller, more manageable, less threatening. And now that you've stepped into your full self, unapologetic, unbothered, undeniable, they recoil. Not because you harmed them, but because you made them irrelevant. You no longer serve a function in their game. You're not predictable. You're not accessible. You've become an artifact of their failure to dominate. You are the evidence that not everyone can be broken. They circle your name now in whispers, not because you're infamous, but because you're untouchable. They tell new people stories of how you changed, how you turned cold, how you think you're better. And every time they speak, their voice stumbles over the truth. You outgrew them. That's the part they cannot say out loud, that you played along until you realized there were no rules, only distractions, that every gesture they made was a setup, every apology a stall, every moment of closeness a test of how easily you could be reset. But you became a fixed point, a yes with boundaries, a no with certainty, a soul that stopped making itself available to anyone who treated it like a toy. Now they avoid you, not because they've healed, but because you terrify them. You're the one who saw it all and didn't flinch. The one who made their best efforts look like failed theater. You never shouted. You never exposed. You just left. And that absence is louder than any accusation could ever be. Because people can dismiss words, but they cannot unfeel energy, and your departure stripped them of theirs. You left behind a mirror they can't turn away from, a reminder that their greatest manipulation couldn't outlive your quietest decision. Let them replay it. Let them craft new versions. They are storytellers now with no ending that favors them, because you are not just someone who survived, you are someone who transformed. Your detachment was not escape, it was elevation. You moved into a space where they can no longer reach, not because you climbed, but because you ceased to descend. The statement you made was not one of vengeance, it was one of evolution. You became the sentence at the end of their paragraph. And you didn't write it in anger. You wrote it in truth. There's a sacred violence in choosing self-respect over drama, in walking away without needing witnesses. You didn't burn bridges, you let them crumble under the weight of their own deceit. You didn't win their game, you ended it. And now, every time someone asks about you, they hesitate, because you're no longer a character in their plot. You're the author of a narrative they never saw coming, one where you were never broken, only unfinished. And now, you're beyond definition, beyond reach, beyond blame. They thought it was a game. You made it a statement, and the echo of that statement is forever. They danced in circles, loud and chaotic, masking the desperation behind every move. They were never trying to change. They were trying to be seen. Every gesture was performative, every apology calculated, every post, every message, every sudden moment of vulnerability was a performance for an imagined audience. They moved for attention, not evolution. Not once did they look in the mirror and ask, what do I need to face? They were too addicted to being looked at to bother becoming someone worth looking at. You watched it all, not in hatred, not in envy, but in quiet study. Because while they were performing for praise, you were preparing for freedom. You were preparing for freedom. You didn't need eyes on you. You needed truth in you. You moved with intention. And that's what drew the line. They wanted to be the loudest voice in the room. You wanted to be the most honest. Their volume was their strategy. Your silence was your strength. They tried to spin, distract, provoke, all in the name of attention. Because attention to them was oxygen. Validation, applause, reaction. It didn't matter if it was admiration or fear, as long as someone was watching. But you were done being an extra in someone else's circus. You weren't in this to be followed. You were in this to be free. They moved for an audience. You moved for peace. They twisted truth to fit their narrative. You shattered lies to reclaim your soul. Their progress was a costume. Yours was a scar turned into strategy. You didn't post your healing, you lived it. You didn't update the world with every step. You took the steps no one saw. The kind that don't trend, the kind that take everything. While they searched for the next person to validate their storyline, you deleted the script entirely, started fresh, wrote your own damn narrative, and when you showed back up, calm, clear, untouchable, they paid because you weren't part of the game anymore. You were now the standard. They still dance for eyes. You walk with direction. Psychologically, those who rely on attention are running from the void within. They chase noise so they don't have to sit with silence. They fill rooms with performance so they don't have to feel the collapse waiting at home. But you faced it. You sat with the ache. You let it bleed. You made art from it. You carved intention out of abandonment. You didn't move because someone watched. You moved when no one did. You moved when it hurt. You moved when it was hard. You moved because you were tired of repeating patterns and pretending it was destiny. That's why your stride is different now. It carries weight. They envy you now. Not because you're loud, but because you're certain. Because while they keep reaching for reaction, you remain unmoved. You became sovereign. Untouched by the chaos, unbothered by applause, they still post, still shout, still dress wounds as wisdom and call it depth. But depth can't be faked. And you earned every inch of yours. Not from likes, from loneliness, from sitting in the ashes long enough to rise with a plan. They can't understand it. Because your validation was never for sale. Because you didn't need to be seen to feel whole. They told people you changed. You did, radically, intentionally. Not for shock, but for salvation. You didn't need pity. You needed power. So you built it from every breakdown they laughed at, from every silence they misunderstood, from every step they thought was weakness. You were never stumbling. You were recalibrating. And now that you move with clarity, they call it ego. But ego needs an audience. You need only alignment. You're not louder now. You're deeper. And that depth, it can't be mimicked. It intimidates. They try to mimic your calm, but it shakes, because calm without accountability is a mask. You wear yours like skin, earned, tested, real. They throw quotes online hoping for admiration. You speak few words, but your actions echo louder. They call it mystery. It's not mystery, it's mastery. You've learned to move without noise, to act without needing reassurance, and that unnerves them. Because they move for applause, you move for purpose. Let them perform. Let them dance for digital gods and momentary praise. You're building something quieter, something real, something unshakable. You don't correct the rumors. You don't clarify your choices. You live in such a way that those who matter don't question, and those who question no longer matter. You were never designed for performance. You were built for impact. And you've stopped trying to be understood by the ones addicted to misunderstanding themselves. Now, when you walk into a room, you don't chase attention. You shift energy. They feel it. The ones who once underestimated you now wonder how you did it. The truth? You didn't rise for them. You rose in spite of them. And your silence, your stride, your presence, it speaks in a language they never learned. You stopped moving to be seen. You started moving because you finally saw yourself. That was the difference, and it changed everything. They didn't come at you directly, not at first. That would have been too obvious, too easy to expose. No, they preferred the subtle stabs, the soft poison, the sarcasm laced with sweetness, the just kidding that landed like a dagger. They tried to provoke you into playing small, not by outright aggression, but by suggestion, by implying you were too much, too intense, too emotional, too ambitious. They crafted sentences like cages, meant to limit your reach while making it feel like your idea to shrink. And that's how the manipulation works. It never shouts, it whispers, in your own voice. But the game changed when you stopped mistaking comfort for care. When you realized that someone who feels threatened by your growth will never cheer for your wings. They tried to push you back into your old self, but you outgrew that shell with fire. They wanted to be the authority on your potential. They wanted the final say on who you could be. You'd mention a dream, and they'd chuckle. You'd speak a boundary, and they'd raise an eyebrow. You'd express a truth, and they'd twist it into drama. Because to them, your expansion was a threat. Not just to their illusion of control, but to the fragile self-pixie they built by keeping others beneath them. Every time you stepped into your voice, it reminded them of how silent they'd become in their own life. And that mirror, that reflection, unforgivable. So they poked. They tested. They tried to bait you back into a version of yourself that needed permission to breathe. But you've stopped asking for that. You've stopped asking, period. Your silence wasn't weakness. It was your boundary forming in real time. You didn't stop talking because you lacked something to say. You stopped talking because you knew the conversation was designed to diminish you. They needed you to doubt yourself. That was the whole goal. Because a person doubting their power is easy to manage, easy to manipulate. But a person certain of their truth, a person anchored in self-respect, they're ungovernable. And that's what you became. You stopped performing. You stopped pleasing. You stopped shrinking to make the insecure feel large. And now, they can't reach you. Not because you blocked them, but because you expanded beyond their grasp. Psychologically, those who try to provoke others into playing small are often at war with their own unfulfilled potential. Your growth exposes their stagnation. Your confidence punctures their performance. That's why they mock your voice. It's louder than their ego can tolerate. It's why they question your decisions. It reminds them they never made their own. You became a walking contradiction to everything they've settled for, and instead of rising with you, they chose to resent you. But resentment is just jealousy in a mirror. And your reflection became their judgment. They labeled you arrogant the moment you stopped apologizing for existing. They called you selfish the moment you prioritized your peace over their comfort. They said you changed when you finally returned to yourself. Every word they used against you was a projection, a confession. And you let them speak. You let them bark their narrative into a void. Because you realize that arguing with someone committed to misunderstanding you is just another form of staying small. You had better things to do. You had healing to hold. You had purpose to protect. You chose your growth over their guilt. And they felt it like an earthquake. They wanted you tame, manageable, palatable. They weren't ready for the version of you that no longer needed permission, the version that no longer flinched when questioned, the version that stood tall in rooms built to make you kneel. You didn't rise to prove them wrong. You rose because playing small became suffocating. You didn't transform to spite them. You transformed to survive, to evolve, to finally breathe. And now that your light no longer bends to fit their shadows, they pretend they don't see you. But they do. And it terrifies them. They tell others you switched up, that you think you're better, but the truth is, you remembered your worth. You stopped engaging in conversations that required you to forget your value. You no longer give discounts on your time, your love, your energy. You no longer explain the parts of you that demand depth. You are not for everyone. And you never were. But back then you tried to be. You tried to comport, compress, dilute, but no more. You learned that shrinking for others is the slowest form of self-erasure. And now that you've reclaimed your space, their discomfort is just confirmation. Let them sit in their judgment. Let them whisper in rooms you've outgrown. Their words have no weight anymore, because the version of you they tried to provoke has been retired, replaced by someone who no longer performs for praise, someone who no longer needs applause to move. You don't entertain smallness anymore. You embody expansion. And when they tried to pull you back into the cage, they found it empty. You didn't argue. You didn't explain. You just left. And now they're stuck debating with ghosts. You move differently now, with a grace that comes from grieving your past self, with a sharpness that comes from surviving psychological warfare. You know the tactics now. You see the signs. And the moment someone tries to belittle what they do not understand, you withdraw, not to punish, but to protect. You know what it costs to shrink, and you refuse to pay that price again. You're done being digestible. You're done being quiet for the comfort of those too loud in their own insecurity. So let this be your reminder. Their provocation was never a reflection of your weakness. It was evidence of your power. They saw it before you did, and they tried to contain it. But power like yours doesn't shrink. It breaks ceilings. It bends walls. It rewrites legacies, and the only game you play now is expansion. On your terms, in your truth, for your freedom. Let them talk. You've got bigger things to become. They thought you'd keep playing, keep nodding, keep smiling politely while they poked your boundaries like they were optional. They mistook your silence for submission and your stillness for surrender. Because that's what people like them count on, that you'll bend before you break, that you'll keep the peace even if it means tearing yourself apart. But something shifted. Not all at once, not with fireworks. No, it was quiet. It was precise. You didn't shout, you didn't explain. You simply carved a line, firm, unshakable, final, a line that wasn't up for debate. And when they crossed it, thinking you'd fold like before, They revealed the very thing they were hiding all along: their own limits. Because power built on your compliance dies the moment you stop giving it oxygen. You weren't playing hard to get. You were done being easy to manipulate. That's what they couldn't stomach. They had grown used to pushing you just far enough to feel powerful, then pulling you back in with just enough charm to keep the illusion intact. It was never connection. It was control. And once you saw the pattern, you stopped dancing. You stopped responding to their half-assed apologies, their breadcrumb affection, their manufactured drama meant to keep you off balance. You saw it, you named it, and then you walked not away from them, but toward yourself. That line you carved wasn't about punishment, it was about preservation.